Really wish I could point to all the different places I've looked at over time and trying to figure out the best way to get footage out of Resolve and into Nuke and have all the data available to you. But really, honestly, I kind of picked up little bits and pieces here and there, and over trial and error was kind of able to come to a workable solution. Now I'm going to show a few different scenarios, some of which work and some of which don't, but the main idea is that at least in Nuke right now, as of me making this, I don't believe there's a curve to interpret the color data that you get off of Blackmagic raw footage. Now, right now, when you bring it into Resolve by default, you can use your project settings to interpret the color. I'm going to kind of undo that right now. I'm going to right-click on here and go to Camera Raw Codec Settings and go to Edit DNG Codec Settings. And when I do that, I can see it by default it's using Project. I'm going to set that to Clip. And by default, the way it comes off the camera is Blackmagic Design Film. I don't really know if it matters if you click on Highlight Recovery here, but the main thing I'm not going to do right now is use this exposure setting here. I'm going to talk about why a little bit later on. So for now, I'm going to close this out. This is what it looks like when it came straight off the camera. This is Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera footage. I thought that there was slightly different curves for Pocket Cinema camera footage and regular cinema camera footage, but right now the options that I have, at least in Resolve, that I'm finding are the same. So this is the footage straight off the camera. I'm going to go in and go to my Edit tab, and I'll go ahead and drag this down into here. And I'll go to the Color tab. This is only one frame, by the way, but it's going to get across the idea well enough. So here I have this frame that hasn't been adjusted color-wise at all yet, and I have my project started up here. I'm going to go ahead and get this into Rec 709 color space, as if I was just bringing this into Resolve and I wanted to do my color corrections in here. And initially I wanted to get it looking the way that the camera, if I shot it in video mode, would look. So I'll right-click on this, go to 3D lookup table, and for Blackmagic Design, I'll do the Blackmagic Cinema Camera Film to Rec 709. So if you're not sure, at least from as far as my understanding, Rec 709 is the color space you would have for like a DVD or a Blu-ray or things like that. So I'm going to go and click on this, and this is roughly how this looked when I shot it. Now it's pretty dark here. But of course, since we're especially working with raw footage, you can make this a lot brighter. And maybe what I'll do right now is I'll actually go ahead and do that. So I'll add a new serial node. So command, oops, sorry, the option S. And so this one you can see I have the lookup table on there. And on this one, just so I can see that right out the gate, if I export out of Resolve and into Nuke, just applying this Rec 709 space, I'm not going to have all those values come over correctly. So if I go ahead and in this node right here, I'm going to go ahead and do a color correction. I'm just going to pump up the gain just to keep it simple. And so I can see what's going on, I'm going to go to my, let's see, workspace, video scopes, and I'll go and turn these on so I can kind of see what's happening color-wise as I'm doing this. I'm going to keep pumping this up until I have the values going above, you know, what are considered usable values. So of course, if I pump this up past here, these values would be beyond 1, and this is over here, I think, is this little area right here where I have the floor here. And right now, this is not really a great, so I'm sorry, I'm not used to using the mouse on the Mac here, so this is working a little bit funkily right now. But you can kind of see these are kind of clipping right here and are beyond white. And I'm going to push this even more to make this a little bit more obvious. So there we go. Oops, I'm going to do that. And I'll go ahead and do Shift F so we have a bigger view. So you can see these values are above 1 right now. And if I was to continue to color correct and Resolve, that wouldn't matter because Resolve is working in float color space and I have all these values way up here, but if I brought them back down, they'd still be there. The problem is, if I go ahead and now go to export this out and try and get it into Nuke where I want to do my compositing work, I'll go through all the setup, all the settings that should allow me to retain that color data, even though it's not going to in this case. So I'm going to go and use individual source clip names, and I'm going to render out a EXR file. They just tend to work well in Nuke, it seems like. And if I remember correctly, at least in these images I was using more recently, this compression scheme was working the best. So I'm going to go and choose that. I'll go and render at source resolution. In this case, it was 1920 by 1080, but if I was using like the regular Blackmagic Cinema camera, maybe I wouldn't want to lose the extra resolution, the 2K resolution. So I'll go and scroll on down. I'm going to click on this more options here, and I'm going to change the video data level to data 0 to 1023. So this should keep the data level, at least as far as my understanding. It's not going to clamp the values at all a little bit. So you can see the 64, 940. This is going 0 to 1023. I'll go and continue on down. And save as, I'll just keep it as the source file name, just to keep it simple. And again, I'm going to go and scroll down and do more options. And just to make sure I'm not losing any quality, I'm not sure if it really would cause me to lose it, but I'm going to see force sizing to highest quality and also force debayer resolution to highest quality. So when it's kind of unpacking the raw information, do that at the highest quality it can. Don't try and trade off for speed. And let's see, let me go ahead and make sure I'm exporting out to the folder that I want. So render 2, I'm going to go ahead and just render this out to the desktop. Let's see, so I'll do desktop right here, Resolve Scratch. Now it's a different account, let's see. Let's see, Macintosh hard drive, users. I'm John, by the way, nice to meet you. And I'll go and do desktop, and I'll just do it to the desktop. That should be simple enough. Okay, so I have that set up. And again, just a few settings I adjusted. I'm rendering out a EXR, and I put the compression on there so the files aren't absolutely huge. Using the source resolution, in this case, it's the same anyway. Putting the video data level to data, and then down here, under options, I'm forcing the sizing and the debayer to the highest quality. I'll go and add that to my render queue, and I'll go and render out this one frame. It should be quick since it's just that one frame. Now, let me go ahead and load up this footage into Nuke on my second monitor, and then I'll go ahead and drag over that window. And let's see. Okay, so there's that EXR file, and I'll go and drag this over here so you can see what I'm doing. So now, by default, Nuke is made from the ground up to work with linear. And by the way, a really great resource I found, the gentleman's last name is Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T. If you do a Google search for Nuke linear workflow or something, or Nuke color space, Wright, he has a really nice PDF that explains how Nuke's color management system is set up. And it's really, really nice, and I didn't actually understand all of it from the get-go, so it's worth taking a look at and maybe downloading and keeping. So by default, if I go into Nuke here, I can see that from the get-go, the color is actually looking good in this case, aside from it being blown out. Now, if I go ahead and press S for settings to do my lookup tables, I'm going to talk about this more in a little bit, and this is all covered in his PDF file, but the type of files you bring in are going to be interpreted in a certain way. So whenever you bring a file into Nuke, it's automatically converted into linear space as far as the amount of values, color values that's available to it. It does make some assumptions based on the type of file that comes in on what the actual file is. So if I double click on this, you can see the color space, it's defaulted to linear, and that's based on the file type. EXR, it assumes are linear because that's usually used for like out of Maya or 3D Studio Max. An EXR file is usually used for animation and render passes and things like that. So it's actually not bringing this in correctly in this case because the color space I converted it to was Rec 709. And so the first thing is when you bring in with a read node, you need to tell, hey, what type of color space was the actual file meant to be. You can always go to your project settings and set up your lookup table. So in this case, it thought it was a float file, and so it defaulted to linear. But you can change your defaults, but in this case, I'm just going to go in and do it for this one. Color space, I converted it to Rec 709 Resolve, so I'm going to choose Rec 709 here. And just so I'm viewing it correctly, I'm going to go in and change my viewer to Rec 709 as well. So this should be, roughly, if I go back and Resolve, it should look the same. If I do that, here's that, you can see that they do look, in fact, the same. So I know that my color has come in correctly, but the problem here, I'm going to go ahead and turn on my scopes in here. So window, I'll do a waveform. I can see that my values are all the way up here at 100%. And if I go ahead and try and do an exposure node to bring that down, you can see that the ceiling has been hit here. So this is like if I had values above here, which I did in Resolve, they went way up here. Remember, I brightened it up. All those values, when I brought it into Nuke like this, are gone. So the way it's been exported out, those values haven't been retained. So this is what I was struggling with, and this is what we're going to try and combat here. So I'm going to go and jump back into Resolve. I'm going to talk about how we can fix this. So I'm going to go back to the Color tab, and let me go ahead. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and adjust this slightly here. So I'm going to leave this correction here to get the color way up past where it should be, because I want to make sure that once I bring it into Nuke, I'm not going to lose these values that are up here. So remember, if I disable this node, I have my values here, and as I brighten them up, they went all the way up here, and when I brought them into Nuke, they're getting cut off here. So what I want to do now is go about it to where I'm not going to lose those values. So I'm going to keep this first step the same, to where I'm taking the raw footage, which I'm going to disable these two for now. So the raw footage that came off the camera, I'm using this lookup table to bring it from the camera raw, or the Blackmagic camera raw, to Rec 709. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put it into, I'll do Alt-S to add a new node. Then I'm going to convert it to, under Visual Effects In-Out, I'm going to go ahead and choose Rec 709 to linear. Now I can't take credit for this. There was, in one of the many forums that I was looking through, a gentleman was talking about how, I think it was RA Alexa footage, before they had the curve inside a Nuke, to use that data, they converted it from the Alexa curve to Rec 709, and then they converted that to I believe I'm remembering this correctly. Then they converted it to linear, and that made created an opportunity where Nuke did know the curve. So if I go to these project settings again, I look up the lookup tables, you can see these are cameras that it has lookup tables for. So, and just see the curve. So linear is a straight line like this, linear, as you expect. And then most cameras, like if you look at red log or things like that, when you have logarithmic, you have data stored in a different way, so they can squeeze in more values here than just a regular camera could. And that started with kind of Cineon. So if you look at Cineon, that had a particular color. Since all kinds of different cameras have a different curve, the color is interpreted differently. And from what I understand, Cineon was kind of the first one. But Blackmagic has their own curve, but they haven't really ever released that outside of Resolve, so no one really knows the correct way to interpret the color. So in this case, we're going to take it from the Blackmagic RAW. We're going to get it to Rec 709, which is what we kind of want it to be displayed as. But so Nuke can interpret it correctly, we're going to go ahead and go to linear. So again, just to make sure, 3D lookup table, Visual Effects In-Out, I'm going to go ahead and choose Rec 709 to linear. And just so I can actually, so when it's put into linear, by the way, it's super dark. So it is there, you just can't really see it. I'm going to go ahead and re-enable this node here so I can see this again. And I'm going to go ahead and continue to really up the gain on this just so I can see, and I'll bring this scopes over here. So again, I can see my goal here is not to make this color corrected prettier right now, but just to show that this is actually going to be working. I'm going to keep pumping this up until these values would have been really blown out. So I can see that this is going way, way high beyond this threshold here. And this is mainly for these guys right here. I'm going to go ahead and keep pumping this up just to really drive home that we're not going to lose these values. And that's just probably good enough, I'm guessing. So you can kind of see this is really, really blowing out. This is starting to get there. Not quite yet, but it's getting there. And so I'm going to go ahead and export this out. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the Deliver tab, and I'm going to drag this off the screen again. I'll go ahead and delete this guy, this one to render queue, and I'll render this out. Okay, we'll go ahead and render. Here we go, so that's done. Jump back into Nuke, and I'll go ahead and refresh this. So reload, and I'm going to go ahead and split this horizontal and drag this over here so I can see my image as well. And let's go and see what we've got here. So I need to change this slightly because in this case, this actually is in linear space now. So I need to tell it, like, hey, you know what? The color space coming out of Resolve was linear, so I need to tell it that, linear. And just so I can make sure that this is coming in the same, I'm going to change this to the none. So if I, and I didn't maybe mention this much, so the viewer itself, which is just right here, needs to tell how I want to display this. Like, what's the destination color space that I want it to be in. It's not going to change how the color is actually being dealt with here, imported as, and it's not dealing how Nuke is dealing with the color, because it's only going to be doing all of its mathematical operations inside of linear space. This is just how it's going to display in the viewer, and the way you display it in the viewer is this drop down up here. Now I bypass this for now, I said none, just so I can go back into Resolve and see that, okay, those do look the same. So now I know that, okay, it's at least bringing it in the way I want. Now, my goal, let me disable this, the exposure node. My goal is to have this in Rec 709. So I'm going to go and put Rec 709. And again, the reason being is that if I went back into here, is along the line here, remember at the beginning, I did put this to Rec 709. So I'm going to go ahead, jump back in here, and here we kind of have this working the way that it's intended to work right now. So the main thing to look at here, though, is if I go ahead and use this exposure node, these values, and I'll go and reset this to 0, even though it's barely anything right now. So when I set this to 0, you can see that this is, I'm just going to turn this off for now, just so we can see. These values are clipped, or not clipped, but they're squished up here. But if I go ahead and use my exposure node and down the exposure, you see those values are still there. It didn't come down as a straight line like it hit a ceiling. It's coming down and retaining that nice smooth fall off that we wanted, and you can see that none of these values are clipped here. So if we do that process, we shouldn't lose any values. Now there's a couple other things that are useful, and I was curious if it would cause problems. So let me talk about what did cause me problems when I was doing this first time. And I didn't think the setup was working at first, but it actually was. So the issue was that if I go to, instead of using this node to pump up the brightness as a corrector, I'm going to disable that. If I wanted to up the exposure, when you shoot with Camera Raw, one of the nice panels that becomes available is this Camera Raw panel right here. And you would think that adjusting the exposure would be a good idea because you're just, processing the raw values. And again, just so we can see, while I'm adjusting this, I'm going to bring this over here. I'm going to keep upping this until these values are above here. So, this is not like a good exposure, but let's imagine I got this roughly looking the way I wanted. I'll make it brighter just so I can exaggerate this again. But so my values are above here, but it looks a lot better than it did before I did the camera because it was completely black before. But if I go ahead and go to the Deliver tab and try and export this out again, add to render queue, start render, and I go back into Nuke again, and I reload this footage, I'm not going to look at as much in here, but I'm just going to look, for the most part, at this right here. So here's it coming straight in from Nuke, straight into Nuke. I'll go ahead and add an exposure node. And the only thing I've done different here is instead of adjusting the color through a node right here, I adjusted in the Camera Raw settings here and adjusted the exposure here. And again, I would have thought that would have been a good thing. But if I down the exposure now, I can see that, oh, that did hit a ceiling. All those values that were up here and still available in Resolve are actually gone now. So I guess the lesson to take from this is that you can't actually use the exposure slider. I'm not sure if any of these would cause problems at all in the Camera Raw adjustments. So you don't want to do them in here. So I'm going to put this back to 0. And any adjustments I want to do, I'm actually going to do in nodes here. And that seems like that will give me a good result. So again, if I go back to this and I was to render this out, it will work just fine. I'm going to do slightly different. So I was worried once I figured out that the Camera Raw settings weren't usable. I was wondering if, I bought a spider checker, a color chart, because I feel like that saves me quite a bit of time. I'm going to go and turn that off for a second. And I'll turn this guy off for a second. So now I'm just at this very beginning node. I'm going to turn off this initial lookup table that was taking me from the Blackmagic Raw to the Rec 709. I'm going to turn that off so it has that washed out look. And instead this time I'm going to use my color chart. So I'll go ahead and go to the color chart tab right here, and I need to make sure I use the right color. So data color spider checker, I'll go and select that. I'll use my color chart right here, and I'll give myself some room. There we go. And I'll go ahead and line this up real quick. And the nice part about this, I think you saw, I didn't do white balance or anything when I was initially doing this. I was just trying to see really if if I could get this workflow working. But since I had the color chart here, I can go ahead and use this to kind of get the color. But and I'll show you the before and after in a little bit. But right now, if I go ahead and view this and I say, okay, what am I coming from? My source gamma was Blackmagic Design Film. My target gamma is going to be Rec 709. I'm going to go and click on Match, and that's going to kind of even out my color. So you can't really see the color that much there. I'm going to go and re-enable this brightness version one. And maybe that's up way too high now. I'll go ahead and go to here, and I'll down my gamma a significant amount. Maybe I'll just reset that. There we go. And just brighten it up from scratch. So the benefit of this, I'm going to turn off this display right here, is here's before and here's after. But maybe it's better if I compare it with this. So I'm going to disable this one and enable this one. Oh, let me go and disable that. Let's see. Let me add another serial node so I can show the regular Rec 709. So I have everything disabled except for this bumping up the color. I'm going to go ahead and add my original one I used, my Blackmagic design, to Rec 709. You can see how warm this is. That's because I didn't white balance it correctly. I mean, you can see this, I think it's supposed to be a white right here. That's a very warm color right here. So it converted the color fine, but my white balance in, you know, a true red maybe isn't a true red, and a true yellow isn't really a true yellow. But if I use this little color chart, you can see these are more accurate colors. If I was doing very artistic, stylistic lighting on set, I wouldn't want to use this because it would try and reset that color, I guess, so to speak. But if I'm trying to get natural color, this should get me there a lot quicker. And so I was curious, would this break the linear workflow? So I'm going to go ahead and I went, remember in this color chart, I went to Rec 709. So basically I did the first step here, but I also adjusted the color to be more accurate as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring this back into, just to remind you, this Rec 709 to linear. I'll go ahead and enable this. And so I've taken it from the Blackmagic RAW, or Cinnamon DNG RAW, to the Rec 709, like before, just in a different way. And now I'm putting it back into linear, and I'm going to go ahead and again bump this up quite a bit in the gain, just so I can see if I'm going to lose these color values. And I'll drag over my, oh, not grabbing the right spot, there we go. Drag this guy over while I do this so I can see that the values are going to go well above that. If I'm doing this a dumb way, I could do this way faster, else another way, I apologize, just trying to get the job done. All right, so these are blowing out again. If I go to the Deliver tab, I'll drag this off screen, and last time, I promise, almost done. I'll go and X this out, add to render queue, start render, and go back into Nuke again, and I'll just go and reload this, and I'll disable the exposure so I'm seeing this correct out the gate. And there we go. So I have these values that are being kind of squished up here, but again, the hope is that those values aren't gone. So I'll go ahead and re-enable my exposure, and thankfully, my values aren't just being brought down, clamped. I actually have that nice, all that data up there and still available to me. So this took me quite a lot of digging to look up and figure out, and maybe it's a simple thing and just I haven't seen it in forums, but a lot of people were really confused by this, trying to get this working, and after plenty of time messing around with it and scouring through all kinds of different forum posts, it kind of came to this kind of workflow. Hopefully this will be useful to you, and yeah, hopefully it'll save the pain that I had to go through. So anyway, thanks for watching.